Now, banks have been at the centre of criticism, as we all know, after most of them refused to pass the interest cut on in full from last week. And one of Australia's biggest investors has defended the banks, claiming it'll have dints in the balance of superannuants only. That's the only impact from failing to put on this cut into the mortgages of Australians. The Victorian government also has banned a dodgy solar panel company from its billion-dollar rebate scheme after safety defects were exposed. Let's talk now to the editor for the Australian economics editor at the Australian, Adam Crichton, and former chief economist of the Prime Minister, Dr. Andrew Stone. Gentlemen, I want to start with your criticisms or analysis of criticisms, Adam Crichton, if I can. Sure. This stoush between Peter SWITZER and the Credlin Institute. What's going on there?
Yeah, certainly. Look, this is the first episode in a six-part series looking at the housing market, which I've been hosting, and the first episode launched just this afternoon. Peter SWITZER was one of the stars, and we also had someone from the Credlin Institute, Brendan Coates, as well. We had someone who was a boomer, that was Peter, and someone who was a millennial, and they debated kind of basically who's done it tougher in terms of buying a house, in terms of getting on the housing ladder. Look, I don't think that we resolved the issue, but certainly lots of issues were thrashed around, including the secular decline in interest rates, which of course has massively ratcheted up house prices. So if you bought a place in the 80s or the 90s, you may have paid $50,000, $60,000, and now that place could be worth $1 million, which of course is great for the owners, and indeed may be great for their children if those children are lucky enough to have parents who bought then. But it's not so lucky for buyers now who don't stand to inherit and indeed who can't afford a deposit.
Yeah, I'm loath to get the violins out for young people buying homes, though, Andrew Stone, because many of them want to live where their parents brought them up. And often when you're a young person buying your first property, you've got to buy the flat you can afford, and it's a one-bedroom, not a three-bedroom, and it's out in the burbs because you've got to get your foot in the market. And, of course, it used to be the case that you'd start off with second-hand bed and a second-hand washing machine. You didn't take holidays and you save your deposit. But, of course, now we want it all. We want to renovate as soon as we move in. We still want to go overseas, and we want kids in private school. We're not really living within our means, are we?
No, that's the thing. I think there is a lot of truth to that. So there are inflated expectations about what one should expect to be able to do when one's young. And that certainly is colouring people's expectations or views about how difficult the housing market is. That said, I do have some sympathy for young people, particularly because over the last 3.5 decades or so, Australia's had three major run-ups in house prices in the second half of the 1980s. Then after a bit of a correction, there was another big run-up from the mid-90s to about 2003. Now, both of those were driven by deep structural forces in the economy, in particular the taming of inflation from high sort of double-digit variable rates to a steady 2.5%, and the resultant structural decline in nominal, in interest rates. The nominal interest rates came down, and as Adam was pointing out, the result is that people can afford to pay a lot more for houses, and so they did. The thing is that the last big house price rise that occurred from roughly mid-2012 to mid-2017 wasn't driven by these big structural forces. And my own thesis is that a large part of that actually is driven by immigration, that we have massively increased the demand for housing by effectively doubling an already extremely rapid immigration program. And that's caused house prices over the space of 5 years in Sydney, for example, to go up by 75%. And in that case, I have a lot of sympathy if you're a young person young Australian who's wanting to get into the market and suddenly finds that as you're struggling to try to get that deposit, even on the outskirts of the city, it just keeps getting further and further away. So there is some basis for sympathy.
All right, well, you're generous, aren't you? Very generous. Adam Crichton reports today too, the ANZ is going to be paying back consumers who were ripped off in the sort of evidence that we heard in the Royal Commission, fees for no service, and many other things. To the tune of $500 million that will be repaid to consumers. Where will the other banks be on this sort of payback as well?
Well, look, the paybacks are broadly the same for each of the big four, and indeed they do sound very large numbers. But the reality is these are just flesh wounds, really, for these institutions, which make multi-billion-dollar profits every year. And of course, their revenues are much larger than that. So I think unless the actual structure of the sector changes, unless their policies and procedures change, these sorts of events will eventuate again in the future. And so, so far, I mean, it seems like 1 year on from the Royal Commission almost, not a great deal has really changed yet. In fact, I'm quite looking forward, I must say, in a few weeks to doing a then and now column in the Australian and just basically point out all of the core financial statistics that existed last year and that existed this year, and I'm pretty sure they're all going to be largely the same.
Andrew, you've got to wonder when governments are going to learn about heavily subsidising policies in and around election campaigns that, if they're not properly monitored, cause them a lot of grief. We saw this with pink bats and school halls and all those other stimulus programs, if we remember back then in 2007, sort of 2008 period, right through in 2010 and 2011 under Julia Gillard, those last two in particular. But in Victoria, the Andrews government has a $1.5 billion scheme for subsidies regarding solar roof panels. And of course, when you put government money on the table, in come all the shysters and the fly-by-nighters, and that's precisely what's happened in Victoria. With reports today, they've had to go after a couple of installers and pull them out of the scheme, and there's risks now associated with the work they've done.
Absolutely. You mentioned pink bats. Thankfully, in this case, at least, it seems that the auditors have at least found some of the problems with some of these companies before we've had any deaths as yet, thank God. But this is the general trouble. Whenever you hand out government money, you, as you say, attract a lot of shysters into the market who find that, because there's funding available. It also really, so it's very frustrating to see this. Hopefully the damage is slightly less bad, mainly because state governments are actually slightly better at running these sort of schemes, even though they're still a bad idea, than the federal government that had no experience whatsoever in doing this. But the other general point I always come back to when you see schemes like this is, again, we're forever being told that solar is the way of the future, wind is the way of the future, and so forth. How come 20 years on from, or 25 years on from when we started being told this sort of stuff, we're still having to subsidise, massively subsidise these schemes to get people to take them on board? It's absurd the degree to which we have governments taking huge amounts of taxpayer money and directing them to the things that the government thinks are good, rather than letting people just keep more of their own money and decide what they want to spend it on themselves.
Yeah, and we like to talk about an operational market, a free market. If the market was working, seeing that we've had renewables in the system for such a long time, you'd argue they are a mature product. Why does there need to be government intervention at all?
Well, look, certainly I agree with all that Andrew just said then. Look, I don't think it is a normal free market because there are so few suppliers, and those suppliers actually have an incentive to reduce supply and to keep it as low as possible. So I really think the government is kind of on the right track in trying to get more baseload supply into the power system. I think if they could only redirect all of the waste that is spent on these solar schemes and put it into commissioning more baseload power, we would all ultimately be a lot better off. And look, it is really good to see that I think the energy debate finally is improving in this country, and there's more talk of not only nuclear power but more baseload power in general, because I think actually even the advocates of renewable energy are starting to realise that if we don't act soon, in a few years there's going to be a big crisis in this country of power, and probably most people will blame them.
I just want to touch on something before we go, Andrew. BHP, we know that the boss of BHP gave a big speech in London not so long ago talking about social credit, social licences, climate change and many other things. A big departure for a miner that makes money from coal exports and other things. But, of course, now it's going further through the organisation. Another speech, of course, made in London, not in Australia, from BHP, saying that they've got to have things like gender diversity and Indigenous relations. Indigenous, fair enough, because they mine on Indigenous land. But all of these things, they say, climate change and others, are important for them to get a licence to operate. Now, I thought corporations just had to obey the law and return profits to shareholders. Yes,
there are two things that so frustrate me about this. The first point is the flaming hypocrisy of BHP on this subject. So a few months ago, as you say, the CEO of BHP talked about how they decided at BHP that climate change was supposedly an existential threat, and yet to the whole planet. And yet BHP continues to be a major producer of oil and all sorts of miner of coal, producer of oil and so forth. And indeed, in the speech last night, that this other senior BHP official gave, when he was prattling on about all the other social justice initiatives that his company was now going to take on, he boasted about how this had helped them be the first foreign company to secure a new oil licence off the coast of Mexico in 80 years. Now, did it not strike him the incredible sort of hypocrisy of this? The second point I'd make is just very quickly.
Oh, I've got to leave it there, Andrew.
Sorry.
We'll get that. No, you're right. I'm sure it's a good point. We'll have to get to that next week. But you're right, absolutely right. Thanks very much for your time tonight, Adam Crichton and Dr. Andrew Stone.